All right.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second in our Dear Editor series on scientific writing and publishing, and presented by the Research Medical Library. My name is Erica Goodoff. I'm an editor in the library, and I'm joined this morning by Larissa Gann, who is a librarian and associate editor in the library. So we've got an editor and a librarian presenting today. And today's topic is on what is a journal impact factor and why does it matter? And as a reminder, we are recording this session, and for those who are in attendance, we'll send a link to the recording. And also there is a Microsoft team available specifically for this series. We'll have a link to the recording there, as well as there's a link to the previous recording that we did and any handouts that are associated with it. And you can also go back and ask any questions you want there that didn't get answered during the session. But for today's session, any questions that you have, we're in webinar format today, so please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them as we're going along. And yes, Larissa has just posted a link to the team in the chat. If you're not already a member, you can use that. So, okay. Let's get started. And our session today is actually going to start off with a poll. So we want to know, what do you think makes a journal a good journal? So I'll just give people a few questions. Okay.
Nobody's choosing it's pretty. I thought that was a good answer.
Yeah.
But I guess we don't look at the print journals anymore, so we don't know if they're pretty or not.
They all look like PDFs to me.
Sometimes they have nice art on the covers.
That's true. Well, and there are some journals that literally go by like the color of the cover. We're used to.
Yeah, the red.
Even though nobody sees the cover anymore.
Yeah, people would ask for like the green journal or the red journal. Yeah.
Yep. It's more about the contents. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. It is more about the contents of the journal. So close this out.
Okay.
So we're going to get the right screen up. All right. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how we measure journal impact.
I'm gonna share the results of our poll.
Oh,
we should do
that.
Did it
not share?
I don't think so.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
there
thought
it is.
Did.
Yeah, most of you said high impact factor. A couple said popular with colleagues. So we're going to get back to that point a little bit later on as well.
Thanks, Erica. Sorry, I thought I did hit share, but I must not have. Okay, so
all right.
So we want to talk about how we measure journal impact, and I'm going to hit stop sharing for a second. So traditionally, what we've used is something called impact factors, and I think you've all heard of impact factors before. But there are other measures of impact that we want to talk about as well. Journal impact factors, they were created many decades ago. They're owned by a company called Clarivate. So there is an actual proprietary impact factor. Sometimes you'll see on journal websites where people will say that their journal has an impact factor, but they're not referring to the official one from the Clarivate company. So keep that in mind. But you can find journal impact factors in the Journal Citation Reports database on the library website. You can always ask us if you have questions about using that database. And essentially, it's a ranking of a select group of journals. It's not all the journals available that they're ranking. It's journals that they've selected and decided to rank. They use a basic calculation for it. It's a 2-year period that they're measuring, and it involves dividing the number of times articles are cited by the number of articles that are citable. So it's a very simple, straightforward, sometimes controversial measure. And that is what an impact factor is. So if you hear someone say that the journal has an impact factor of 2, essentially what they're saying is on average, an article in that journal is cited 2 times. That doesn't mean every article is going to be cited 2 times, but that is the average that is built from this impact factor. And people typically, when we're asked for impact factors, And the library here, they're looking for journals with really high impact factors, something with a 5 or a 6 or above. But not everyone is going to be able to publish in those journals, so keep that in mind. Also, there's additional measures available. There's actually quite a few other measures available. One that you could take a look at if you're interested in is there's a tool called CiteScore that's in the Scopus database, and we do have access to the Scopus database through the library. You can go to scopus.com, and they measure a couple of other things. The purpose of measuring these other things is to try to provide a little bit more context. They use the SCImago journal rank, or SJR, and they also use SNP. The SCImago journal rank is a prestige-based metric. It's based on the idea that not all citations hold the same weight. So they're trying to incorporate things like the subject field, the quality, the reputation of the journal as well, not just these numbers, but actual quality and reputation. And you can actually Google SCImago if you're interested in looking at their rankings as well. And what SNP does is try to measure contextual citation impact. They're weighing their citations based on the total number of citations in a subject field. So this is what's called normalizing an impact factor or tool measure. They're trying to normalize across the field instead of comparing kind of apples to oranges or oncology to biology. You know, they're quite different. All of these measures are different, and they really can't be compared side by side, but it can give you more context when you're reviewing the impact of a journal. There are some challenges with impact factors, and I feel like it would be remiss of me not to bring up these possible challenges or these challenges with them. They've always been a little bit controversial. Initially, when impact factors were created, they were designed for libraries to be able to use them to purchase journals. So they categorized journals by subject areas like oncology, so that libraries like ours could say, okay, we're a cancer center, we want to buy the top oncology journals, and this is going to be a ranking to let us know. We don't use this anymore for that reason, because we have other measures that are more reliable and accurate than that. But it's still, impact factors still reign in the sort of academic world. They sort of morphed into something different than what they were originally meant for. So some of the challenges with impact factors are that they can be artificially inflated or skewed. And one way they do this is, if you think about the impact factors really driven by a small number of highly cited articles. So journals are looking for articles with large research groups on them. They're looking for articles with hot topics that are going to be cited more frequently to kind of try to build up their citation counts. The impact factor itself, the calculation is a little shady. The denominator of the impact factor only includes articles and reviews. So they're only counting articles and reviews in the denominator, but the numerator includes all the citations from the journal. So what some journals will do is they'll add fluff at the beginning of the journal, like editorials, commentaries, obituaries. Well, I don't want to say an obituary is fluff, but there's fluff at the beginning. People cite these, and those are included in the numerator, which to me is a little bit weird that they're counting them that way, but that is what they do. It is in the fine print of impact factors if you go to their tip sheets, their information sheets. It's also not unheard of for a journal to ask authors to cite their journal when they're publishing. This is another way to artificially increase the impact factor. I think this has been exposed and it's not done as much. But there was a survey not that long ago of researchers, and 20% of them said they'd experienced incidents where an editor had asked them to add citations to a submitted article from their journal. So they're trying to artificially inflate it that way. In the same study, 57% of researchers said they added additional citations to their own papers because they thought it might increase their chance of getting published. I don't know if that actually works. There's no data to say that works. But there's something in the system that makes authors think that if they add more citations to their bibliography for that journal, that maybe it would increase their chance. Even worse than this, or sort of more alarming, is that there are things called citation cartels. And this is where a group of editors will recommend authors to cite articles from each other's journals. So they're gaming the system that way by saying, hey, cite this journal because they're my buddy. I want them to get a better impact factor. So those are some of the ways that they can be artificially inflated or skewed. There's lots of literature out there on that if you're interested. And a more basic way there's just a short citation window. So there's only a 2-year citation window for measuring an impact factor. Most articles in medicine take 8 years for citations to peak. So it's really a snapshot, and it's not giving you the full view. And of course, there's differences between disciplines. Impact factors are not normalized across the fields. So even if you think about journals being ranked in oncology, we know that there's a lot more nuance in oncology than just oncology, right? Breast cancer journals might get cited more highly than leukemia journals. It has more funding behind it. It's got more PR behind it. It just is what it is. It doesn't mean the quality of that research is better. Another thing to keep in mind here, and one of the examples I always like to tell people is the top rated impact factor in oncology is the Cancer Journal for Clinicians. And this is because they publish the American Cancer Society statistics. So they have intentionally or unintentionally kind of inflated their impact factor by publishing those statistics, because we're all going to cite those. So these are just some of the challenges with the impact factors that I want you to be aware of. So let's talk about, besides journal impact, how we're measuring author impact, because we get this question a lot. Typically what we use, at least here at MD Anderson, is we use the H-index, and this is widely used across academia. The H-index is the number of publications with a citation number greater or equal to H. So the screenshot here I have is actually Dr. Pister's H-index from a few days ago. So his H-index is a 92. And what that says is he has at least 92 articles that have been cited 92 times. That's not a normal H-index, just to let you know. Dr. Pister's has been publishing a while. He also is high profile, so his H-index is going to be a little bit higher than average. But if you're interested in looking up your H-index, you can go to scopus.com and look that up. There are additional measures. There are just citation counts, which are used in the H-index. You can also find your citation counts in Scopus. And then some people ask us about Google Scholar. So Google Scholar has their own version of the H-index. It is supposed to be measured the same way that Scopus uses theirs, measures theirs. The difference is that sometimes in Google Scholar, things get indexed and counted that wouldn't be counted in a traditional academic database. So sometimes PowerPoints get counted, or like books or book chapters aren't typically counted in the H-index. Sometimes they are. Sometimes it's higher in Google than it is in Scopus, but there is some inflation that happens through Google Scholar, so we don't typically use that H-index. There's also an I-10 index, which is a measure of 10 articles having 10 citations or more. That's their own index that they've created, and it's just an additional one that's available. So beyond the author impact, there's also social impact. So this is a newer version of measuring impact, is to look at what is known as alternative metrics. So impact factors, citation counts, those take time, right? They take years to build up. An alternative metric is real time, and it shows you that impact right away. So one tool that we do have available is Altmetric. Altmetric you can use. You can actually download a little bookmarklet for your browser. And what it does is it lets you look at an individual article and see, is somebody talking about your article on Twitter, on Facebook? Have they cited you on Wikipedia, which is always interesting? Have you been in the news? Have you been on a blog? All the things that are happening real time are supposed to be posted in Altmetrics. Another alternative metrics is called PlumX metrics. And this is embedded in Scopus and Elsevier records. So if you're in Scopus, you may see this. It also tries to measure things like social mentions, Wikipedia citations, but it also includes things like clicks, downloads, and views. So if you want to see if your article is being talked about or being downloaded, either one of these is an interesting way to take a look at that. Okay. So I'm going to pass this back to Erica.
Okay. Yes, thanks for that. That's a lot of information. So you can see there's a lot of different ways that impact can be measured. We can measure journal impact. We can measure author impact. It's good to be aware of kind of how these things work and what they mean. And I think sometimes more importantly, what they don't mean. But generally speaking, why does any of this really matter? I mean, obviously the the big answer is, promotion, tenure, career advancement, that sort of thing. People look at these metrics because it's a quick, easy, sort of way of summarizing what is this, how productive as a researcher are you? And we talked about there's some limitations to these numbers, but they're worth looking at because people look at them. So that's something to think about. The other thing is just, beyond career advancement, it can help you pick the best journal to publish. A lot of you said in the first poll that impact factor is, one of, if not the main reason that the main factor that you look at when choosing a journal. So that's certainly, there's something to that. It does tell you that a journal, is cited a lot, maybe has a wide reach, that sort of thing. And that's the other thing, it helps define the reach of the journal. How many people are actually citing this journal? So if it's a high impact factor, generally speaking, that tells you a lot of people are probably going to see your article here. But as we've said before, impact factor maybe isn't the only reason, the only factor to consider when choosing a journal. So with that, we have another poll, and we'd like to hear from you. How do you choose a journal before you publish? Okay. I'm seeing answers to all 4. People have responded. I think actually we're watching Larissa, I think your screen is actually showing everybody there we go.
Sorry.
It doesn't matter. It's actually kind of interesting to see it.
I have 2 screens, so it's like kind of, you can't tell who put what in.
No. Polls are always anonymous.
Sorry.
I don't think it matters, but yeah, they're
why it's good to have 2 instructors.
Okay.
So should I share the results?
Sure, let's share the results. So yeah, obviously many of you, the most common response was I chose the highest impact factor. But there were other responses as well. I chose one I read the most. That's a big one. Publishing fastest is an important factor. Yeah, sometimes you just need to get your research out there as soon as possible. And even once in a while, they sent me an email invitation. Sometimes journals do that. You want to be a little careful with that, but we'll come back to that point in a minute. So let's talk about, here we go, I'll close this out. So how do you choose a journal for your research? Okay, so all of you, said we talked about impact factor, but again, that's only one factor that comes into picking a journal. One of the big ones is scope. That just means, what does that journal publish, and is your research consistent with what that journal publishes in terms of topic, certainly, but also in terms of article type. If you're trying to publish a case report and you send it to a journal that does not publish case reports, you're not going to have any luck, getting it published there, just as a common example. And in terms of the topic, you're writing cancer research. If you submit it to a journal that's devoted to only heart disease and your research doesn't have anything to do with that, you might get rejected, not because your research is bad, just because that's not what that journal publishes. So it's worth at least glancing at what the scope of a journal is before choosing it. Other things are reach and reputation. So reach might be, again, how many people see your article. Impact factor gives you some indication of that, but you can also ask yourself, is this a journal I would read? Is this a journal my colleagues would read? Even if a lot of people see it, what matters maybe is, do people who are doing research who would want to see your research actually see it? So you can think a little bit about, I guess, targeting there. And reputation, sort of similarly, have you heard of this journal? Have your colleagues heard of this journal? Another question to ask would be, is this available in PubMed or some of the major databases? It's easy enough to check. If you can, pull up PubMed and you see articles from previous issues there from that journal, then that, researchers are going to be able to find your article there, presumably. And that brings us also to accessibility. So similar question, is it available there? And also, are journals outside of the institution going to be able to see it? I think sometimes we forget at MD Anderson, we have access to a lot of things. Either our library has a subscription to it, or we can get a hold of it for you pretty easily. But researchers at smaller institutions or maybe even independent researchers sometimes have a little bit of trouble accessing a journal that isn't open access or that might be behind a paywall. Maybe all they can see is your abstract. So that's worth thinking about. Do you want your journal or do you want your article to be open access? Sometimes you can pay extra to have it done that way. A little bit, they're cited a little bit more often, but there's some things to weigh that with thinking about open access as well. So just generally speaking, there's some factors that go into choosing a journal beyond just the impact factor. And that's only one of the things. So thinking about reputation, there are a couple of things that you'll want to keep in mind, because once in a while you'll come across a journal that's not just that it's a bad reputation and it has a poor reputation and your research might not get found, but some of them are just downright, you don't even want to go there for other reasons. So I'll turn this one back over to Larissa.
Okay, so there are journals that are considered predatory or at least suspicious because they have some shady practices, I guess is the only way to say it. So you want to look out for these and make sure that you don't fall prey to these practices. These are just a few ways you can tell if a journal might be suspicious. One, if they're spamming you constantly. Now, regular journals that are reputable do spam you as well. But if they're spamming you in a weird way, it looks suspicious, maybe pause and take note of that. If their website looks like it hasn't been updated, I said since 1999, but it's in a long time. If it looks old school, if it looks like it's just not very polished, then that might give you pause as well. If they have spelling and grammatical errors on their website and in their emails, that's a huge red flag. Sometimes they just craft these emails so poorly, they don't even put your name on it. They'll say something like, "Dear precious doctor," or something random. If it seems sketchy, then stop and take note. If they promise you a quick turnaround, I know we said that quick turnaround is something that's ideal, right? We do want a quick turnaround in theory. But if they're saying, "Hey, if you turn it in by Friday, I'll have it on the site by Monday," that should concern you, because that means it may not be going through the appropriate peer review and editorial review processes. And those are necessary for producing a quality issue. So keep that in mind. And if they're not indexed, like Erica said, in major databases like PubMed. So sometimes this is tricky. I just want to point out that sometimes journals look like they're indexed in PubMed, but they're not. There is a way we can check to see if they actually are officially indexed in PubMed. And I have definitely had faculty come to me after they've published and say, "How come my article's not in PubMed?" And it's because it was not indexed in PubMed and they didn't review it ahead of time. And that's upsetting, because this is part of how you get your citation count, is it needs to show up in databases like PubMed or Scopus. So those are things to consider when you're looking for journals. If any of these things pop up, then you want to stop and pause and review. There are a couple tools that we do have available that you can use, so I want to make sure you're aware. As we spoke about earlier, we do have the Journal Citation Reports database. It is available through the library's website, so you can look up impact factors. If you go to a journal website and it says it has an impact factor, unless you absolutely know it has an impact factor, you knew that already, right? Like Journal of Clinical Oncology or Nature Journal, whatever. Check the Journal Citation Reports database. Sometimes these websites say they have an impact factor and they don't. So that database is available for you to use. PubsHub is also available for you to use. It's a great way to just review journals that are available. It'll let you know what the acceptance rates are, the rejection rates are. It'll give you timeframes there, so that if you are in a hurry, that's helpful. It lets you know the reach and the scope. Sometimes if you have a specific type of article, like a case report, you can narrow to journals that will actually accept case reports. So that'll help you narrow down what you're looking for. You can use Cables, which is a database of predatory journals. So if you think it could be suspicious, you can check that Cables database and see if it's on the list of predatory journals. You can also use something called a manuscript matcher. There's two that I've listed here. One is called Jane, which is, I think, the Journal Analyzer Name Estimator. I think that's what it's called. But you can Google Jane or for journals, What it does is you copy paste your title abstract into this little tool, and it'll give you suggestions for journals based on keywords. There's also one called Manuscript Matcher that's part of that Clarivate suite of tools, the same people who make impact factors. So you can put in your title abstract and it'll suggest journals for you. If this is overwhelming, or you feel alone, or you need help, please ask a librarian, because I can spot a predatory journal from a mile away. But two, we can do a little analysis for you and give you some context to help you make your decision, whether that's going to be the best journal for your manuscript. So please reach out and ask those questions. And I think we have a question.
Yes, we have a question about some clarification about turnaround time being a red flag for a predatory journal. Questioner points out there's some good journals that have very low turnaround time, and then names a couple. The thing of it is, these red flags are something to take into context. If it's a journal with a good reputation, that's just probably part of their good reputation. This is a good journal. You've published there, your colleagues have published there, it's cited. Hey, they're great. They're just really fast. But more what you're looking for there would be something really shady, like, oh, we'll have it up in 2 days, and if you pay us a little extra, or something like that, that really sounds sketchy. Yeah, I mean, there are journals that are really good about, oh, we turned this peer review around in a week or two, but I mean, realistically, you can't expect every time, oh, I got it in there and they peer reviewed it in 2 hours. Probably not going to happen. That means they probably didn't look at it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, these predatory journals have gotten better and better at disguising their predatory practices. But if they're offering you a turnaround and you realize that you're not getting peer review feedback or very much, that's a sign that it's maybe not good. So by quick turnaround, I mean super quick turnaround. If they're offering you a week, then it's something you want to stop and maybe just ask them, okay, can I just make sure that it's going through the proper peer review process? You do not want to ever have something come back and not show up on your reference list or not be counted in your citation count because it was considered potentially suspicious, because PubMed will kick it out, or some of these big databases will kick them out. Okay, so how to decide which journal is the best for research? So this is a tough question, like what's the best journal? So a couple of things are, one, talk to your colleagues. Two, look at the reference lists for the articles you're citing, and that'll give you an idea of some of the other journals in the area that you might want to consider. Three, I would use one of those journal analyzer tools, because you can get some suggestions for journals and then go from there and make sure that it makes sense that journal is going to match the scope of what you're doing. So it is like a multi-step process to find the best journal, but there are tools available. Do you have other thoughts, Erica, on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would have said. And, ultimately, it may not even end up being the first journal you submit to. I think that's fairly common. So it ends up, the one that publishes it is the right one, I guess. But, as long as it's not a predatory journal.
Does that answer the question? Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? You can also reach out to the library, and we can talk about, your topic and help you decide on some journals you can look into. I'm not going to tell you have to publish in this one journal, but I'll give you some suggestions for journals around your topic based on the type of article that you're writing.
Yep. And if you have questions that come up after this, remember, you can always go to the Microsoft team, and ask, when we'll monitor that as well. Looks like we do have another question here.
This is a hard one too. So any thoughts on the MDAPI journals? So I think these are the MDPI journals. I'm trying to remember, we had this question just the other day. Let me find the website so I can show it to everyone. So MDPI has a suite of journals. If you're not aware of them, we do have MD Anderson faculty and staff who publish in these journals. These journals are on the borderline of quality. So it's very hard to tell you. I think that if you want, we can always look at it and make sure that it's indexed in PubMed, so it's going to show up in PubMed. I think they're okay journals, but they're not great journals, which is not a good answer. But these journals have gotten better and better at disguising sort of some of their practices. One of our editors actually emailed me last week and asked about one of these journals, and it is very on the borderline of being good and maybe not so good, because they have tons of journals, and they offer a quick turnaround time. And I have heard people say that they didn't feel that the peer review was as thorough as it should have been. But that, again, it's not 100% predatory. It's just sort of meh. So I would say it's a meh journal, if that's helpful. But a really good question. Any other questions? I wish there was like a meh category. Any thoughts of journal rejection rate for quality? Ooh, that's another good question. Erica, do you have a feel for that?
I mean, it's kind of, I don't know. I wouldn't go on that alone. Let's put it that way. There certainly are journals that are very like exclusive and tend to reject a lot of things, but I wouldn't necessarily say that, oh, they didn't reject my article, oh no, they're predatory. You know what I mean? I don't think it's quite that like black and white. You can sometimes the journal tells you like what their acceptance rate is, and it's like, oh, our acceptance rate is 5%. We're really exclusive, and they kind of brag about it. But on the other hand, it's like, well, okay, but then that's also, should I even bother submitting if, you know? So there's kind of two sides to that. I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't go off of rejection rate as the only way of judging a journal's quality. I'm not sure that it's a red flag by itself. I mean, if it's literally 100% acceptance, that's definitely sketchy. But most of the time, you know, journal's not going to like brag about that. So do you have any other thoughts to add to that, Larissa?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I wouldn't look at it in terms of quality because it is reported by the journals, that number. But it could be looked at in terms of like what your time frame is, perhaps. So that's something to think about. If your time frame is, I need to get this out quickly, and it's got a 90% rejection rate, then that might not be the best first journal to pick. If it is predatory, typically it accepts almost everything, whether it's should or not. So yeah, so I might need to do some more research on that. What about an acceptance rate of greater than 50%? I don't think that's a red flag either, because if you think about two new journals that are starting out, they may take a little longer to build up submissions. So in itself, I would not call that a red flag.
Yeah, that's true. It does sort of depend on how many articles they're actually getting submitted to their office.
And when I look for a questionable journal, I look at multiple points and try to assess it that way. It would be nice if everything was just black and white, but it's just not, especially now. It's gotten more muddier and muddier. So we want to look at multiple points and decide what's the best decision for you and your research. So I would not think that was a specific red flag. Did you have a journal in mind? I'm just curious. So now I want to go look at that journal and review it. Any other questions? And I'm going to look at that 50 plus APC. Wait, so APC rate correlating to like the impact factor or to the, so APC rates are the article processing charges that are asked for frequently, that are asked for when you're publishing open access. So in and of themselves, this is what we found is the lower the rate, the more questionable it is, because predatory journals tend to come from other countries that if you pay them $300, that's a big deal. There are a lot of issues around APC rates because journals like Nature are exorbitant, just absolutely exorbitant. And I don't agree with their rates because they also charge us subscription rates that are exorbitant. So you're getting charged multiple times for it essentially. So I'm not sure that an APC rate should correlate to an impact factor, but the bigger these journals get, the more that some of them charge. But it depends on the publisher. And that could be a whole nother session on publishing.
Mm-hmm.
So an article processing charge in and of itself shouldn't be the final deciding factor of whether you choose to publish or not, but it could be a red flag. One, some people can't afford it. Two, if you want it to be open access, you may have to pay that rate. But you want to make sure that it's the right journal still, irregardless of the charge, the fee. I hope that answers it. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, and if you ever want to just get together and chat about this stuff, I love talking about it, or email me and I can look at specific journals, but I loved your questions. So thank you for joining and asking. Okay, how fair is it for journals to charge large sums of money for publication? This is a big issue in publishing in general. And just like I said before, so we pay subscription fees for journals, and then you pay fees sometimes to publish. So then you're paying to read the article that you researched and you published. It's not cool, but it is the way that it is right now. The reason they have open access fees is because they're trying to, in theory, make it open to the world, which I think is a good thing. Because like Erica said before, we have access, you guys have access to anything you want. And if you don't, you can ask for it and we'll get it for you, and you don't have to pay anything. That's not normal. Like most hospitals, physicians, researchers don't have the level of access that you do. So making things open access means more people can read it, more people can access the research, and in theory, it's going to advance that research further. But the amount that they charge, I don't think equals is appropriate. I really don't. It's $1 billion industry. But I'm not sure how we can combat that exactly.
Yeah, it certainly has changed, and those fees have gone way up in the couple of decades that I've been doing this. It was, I mean, I used to work at a publishing house, and even then we charged article processing charges, but it was for printing costs, and it was a whole lot lower than some of what you see now. That was, of course, a while ago. But there was, I think, an assumption that a lot of that was going to be grant funded. So a lot of times, that's what that's coming from. And in a way, you could argue, well, okay, if it's grant funded, or especially if it's NIH funded, it must be good research, but not necessarily. That certainly limits the amount of research that can get published and that everyone can access. So it's controversial. I'm not sure, that could change in a few years. It's hard to say. Certainly. Go ahead.
There are, like, the best way to pay for those fees, if you really want to publish in those journals or make it open access, is to build it into your grant.
Right.
But that requires you to like plan ahead and know, right? And you don't always know what the fees are going to be. There are a few small discounts through the library subscriptions for open access fees, but they're very small. They're like 15%, because that's as much as those publishers are willing to negotiate with us on. So the library is trying to advocate for better access and less costs, but we're so small. The libraries are so small compared to the publishing world. We don't have as much power as they do. So really good questions.
Mhm.
If you have questions about an open access fee or a license, you can reach out and ask us about those too, and we can make sure that you're picking the right license. The main thing is that they should be transparent on their website about what the fee is. If they're not being transparent and completely upfront, then that's a moment for you to pause and say, well, I don't know if I can trust what's happening here if you're not going to be completely honest about what the fee is and stick to that fee schedule. And all the big ones are very transparent on their website about what the cost is.
Mhm.
And the last thing I'll say is the government is moving towards open access data, open access publishing.
Yeah.
So there are certain funds, like if you have Cancer Moonshot funds, that you are required to publish in an open access journal. There's very few people who have those funds, but that came up in the last couple of years where they published somewhere and then didn't realize it has to be open access. So they had to go back and pay that fee. And some of the publishers weren't even willing to go back and do it afterwards. It was very complicated. So check the licensing before you publish and make sure it's the right license for you.
That's also true, and Europe is got a heavy push towards open access. It's not just here, so I think that seems to be a trend.
Europe is way ahead of us on providing open access resources. They boycotted big publishers, and they're really way ahead of us on that. Go Europe. So most authors these days do not own the copyright of their publication. You can choose a copyright license that will allow you to own the copyright. Of course, it's more money typically, but most of us sign away the copyright when we publish because they know they can. That's why most authors don't own copyright. Publishers know that you need to publish. It's required for your job, for your promotions, for your tenure, et cetera. So they know that, Nature, if you want to get in Nature, you're going to pay what you need to pay to get in Nature because they know what that means to your career. So unfortunately, most authors don't even think about the copyright. And journals know that they have us over a barrel. Basically, they know that you're going to pay the fee. So that's why typically we don't own copyright. If more authors were aware up front, they could try to negotiate that up front. These are such good questions. We could do this all day, but we should probably end.
Yes.
Thank you so much for attending. We're going to have another session in a month. I'm going to post it on the team and also on the Inside calendar. And we do have